The United States attacks. A leader falls. The Middle East burns once again. Ezekiel 38 does not begin with headlines. It begins with nations on the move. Long before modern empires existed, a name was already there. Persia. The siege takes shape, and when it closes, it will not be diplomacy that decides the end. It will be intervention. A leader rises in the far north and begins drawing forces around him. Peoples align. Armies organize. A bloc takes shape. The text describes this mass advancing like a storm across the land. Among the ancient names, one passes through the centuries unchanged. Persia, today called Iran. The target is restored Israel, a people returned to their own land, established, visible. The siege begins to take form. The approach is vast. The scene is military. The scale is continental. Then comes the line that shifts the axis of the chapter. I will put hooks in your jaws. The movement receives direction. The march gains momentum. What seemed like mere expansion is revealed as guidance. The bloc continues to advance. The shadow grows. The siege tightens. The tension rises to the edge of confrontation. And when everything is positioned, when the forces are ready and victory appears calculated, the text points beyond the nations. The advance sets the stage. Something greater steps into the scene. The advance matures like a tide rising with steady force, gaining weight with every alliance sealed beyond the glare of attention, and with every movement that in isolation appears ordinary, yet when added to the rest, forms a presence that can no longer be ignored. Forces gather, borders tighten, and the bloc expands until its existence is no longer speculation, but visible reality. At the center of this motion stands restored Israel, established in its land, living in a stability that contrasts with the accumulation of power surrounding it. The siege begins to take shape, not as an immediate explosion, but as a shadow stretching slowly, patient and assured. The coalition moves forward, convinced it controls the rhythm of history. There is number, there is weaponry, there is coordination. The march appears calculated, sustained by superiority and strategy, as though the outcome were already implied in the strength assembled. The horizon fills with movement, and the approaching storm carries the sense of inevitability. Everything seems to answer to human decisions, meticulous planning, clearly defined interests. Then the ground responds. The tremor does not rise from missiles or artillery. It travels through the earth as a deep reaction, shifting mountains, breaking roads, bringing down walls. What advanced in order begins to lose coherence. Confidence fractures. The same mass that moved in tight formation starts to dissolve under unexpected pressure. Confusion spreads among the armies, and the coordination that upheld the bloc gives way to disorientation. The storm meets resistance that cannot be overcome by military calculation. fire falls. Disorder grows. The siege that seemed final begins to collapse from within, like a structure unable to bear the weight of its own advance. Numerical superiority no longer guarantees control, and the gathered force reveals a limit that had never been considered. The war, which appeared to be merely a clash between powers, becomes something larger, an interruption that reshapes the entire field. The offensive reaches a point where no strategic decision is sufficient. Control slips from the hands that organize the attack. The anticipated victory loses form before a presence that alters the course of events without seeking permission. When the noise fades and the dust settles, what remains is not the image of a triumphant empire, but the mark of an intervention that shattered human calculation. The Bloc was formed with precision. The storm advanced with confidence. The siege closed with conviction. And yet the outcome did not belong to the nations. The tremor does not occur merely to interrupt a war. It exposes a boundary. Nations that advanced with confidence discover that there is a line which force cannot cross. The siege that seemed absolute reaches an invisible point where the march ceases to answer to generals and begins to respond to something greater. The world has long believed that history is driven by empires, treaties, and weapons. For extended periods, that impression appeared sufficient. Kingdoms rose, expanded, ruled territories, and disappeared. Coalitions formed, alliances shifted, borders were redrawn. The constant assumption was that power determines destiny. When the Bloc advances against restored Israel, another layer is uncovered. The land reacts. Military order unravels. Confidence fractures. What appeared to be strategic decision becomes exposure. The assembled strength is pressed to its limit, and at that limit something manifests. The shaking is not merely physical, it is revelatory. It breaks the illusion of control. The coalition realizes it is not directing history. It is being directed towards a precise point. The movement that seemed autonomous reveals dependence. The initiative that appeared sovereign reveals summons. Israel, small in territory and surrounded by far greater forces, remains at the center of the stage not as a military power, but as an axis. The confrontation does not revolve around natural resources or regional influence. It revolves around a people bearing an ancient promise and a land that has endured exile and return. The attack is not only territorial, it touches a spiritual line stretching across centuries. When the siege closes and the force appears overwhelming, the tremor declares what no diplomacy can assert. The course of history has a defined limit. The clash is not the end of the narrative. It is the unveiling of who determines the end. The interruption that strikes the armies does more than defeat them. It makes visible what has always stood above them. The exposure is public. The nations observe. The collapse does not unfold in shadows. The impact extends beyond the battlefield and enters collective awareness. The war ceases to be merely regional and becomes a global declaration. What lay concealed behind political decisions and military strategy emerges as undeniable reality. The Bloc assembled believing it would surround Israel. The outcome reveals that it was itself led to the point of collision. Confidence in its own power dissolves when confronted by an intervention that cannot be neutralized. Technical superiority finds no adequate response. The logic of force collides with a sovereignty that does not depend on armies. This is the core of the shaking, the revelation of authority. Not authority secured by territorial dominance, but authority that precedes every empire. The war exposes the limit of nations and the existence of a governance that does not submit to human alliances. The confrontation functions as a boundary between two layers of reality. The visible, directed by leaders and weapons, and the unseen, determining when each movement reaches its threshold. When the dust settles and the noise of battle falls silent, what remains is not only the memory of military defeat. What remains is the evidence that the course of history is not self-sustaining. The coalition discovered this when the ground trembled beneath its feet. The shaking does more than conclude a conflict. It marks a point of recognition. History continues, yet it continues bearing the mark of an intervention that redefined the field. The world may persist in labeling events with political terms, framing them within strategic analysis, revising reports and speeches. Even so, what occurred in that siege stands as a sign that there is an axis that cannot be displaced. The war revealed strength, the shaking revealed authority, and the authority remained. After the shaking passes, something shifts in the air. Not only over the territory where the confrontation occurred, but within the perception of the nations that watched from a distance. The illusion of stability becomes fragile. Confidence in military blocs and strategic agreements no longer appears absolute. The episode does not end the wars of the world, yet it leaves a mark that cannot be ignored. Human power has always operated on the assumption that, with sufficient force, any obstacle can be overcome. Empires were born from that conviction. Coalitions were constructed upon that assurance. The logic is straightforward. Gather allies, expand military capacity, advance when the moment seems favorable. For centuries, this formula produced alternating victories and defeats, yet it rarely challenged the central principle that power determines outcome. The siege against Israel confronts that logic at its root. Strength was assembled. The advance was coordinated. Numerical superiority appeared to guarantee control. Even so, the outcome did not follow the expected script. A limit emerged where none had been anticipated. The battlefield ceased to respond solely to human decisions and began to reflect something that preceded them. This limit is not merely military, it is structural. It declares that history possesses invisible boundaries. Nations may move with apparent freedom, expand influence, redraw maps. Yet there are specific points where the march meets resistance that cannot be negotiated. The confrontation of Ezekiel 38 stands as one of those points. Israel remains at the center, not through the force of its army, but through its function within the scene. The restored land is not only territory, it is a stage. The siege reveals that the dispute surpasses regional interests. and touches something that predates modern alliances. When the coalition advances, it is not merely targeting a country. It is crossing a line that separates human dominion from higher governance. The result exposes the fragility of collective pride. Nations that believe they control the rhythm of events discover that they can be led to a precise point without realizing it. Confidence in their own calculation meets a barrier that cannot be overcome by intelligence or weaponry. History does not bend entirely to human will. This does not eliminate future conflicts. It does not transform the world into stable ground. It intensifies the awareness that each movement may carry implications beyond the surface. War ceases to be only strategic confrontation and becomes an indicator of something greater at work. From that limit onward, every power must face a silent question. How far does its autonomy extend? To what extent are alliances and treaties sufficient to guarantee complete control? The siege against Israel answers without speech. It answers through shaking. The world may continue to reorganize. New alliances may arise. New conflicts may erupt. Even so, the episode remains as a reminder that there is a point where accumulated force encounters something that does not yield. The limit of the nations is not found merely in the span of their territories or the reach of their missiles. It is found in their inability to determine the final outcome when intervention enters the field. The siege demonstrated that human sovereignty is real, yet it is not absolute. That recognition alters the horizon, not through sermon, not through explanation, through weight. The bloc formed with conviction. The advance appeared inevitable. The outcome revealed a boundary. When that boundary is exposed, history ceases to be only a struggle for power and becomes a stage upon which greater authority is made manifest. The nations continue to move. Conflicts emerge, alliances rearrange. Speeches attempt to frame what appears to be nothing more than a sequence of human decisions. Yet certain territories are never merely strategic. They carry something that outlives empires and endures beyond them. The siege against Israel revealed more than military strength. It revealed direction. The coalition believed it advanced by its own resolve and encountered a boundary not marked on any map. The confrontation exposed that history does not respond solely to political calculation. The pattern remains. Blocs take shape. Forces draw near. Confidence builds until it seems sufficient. When alignment tightens around that land, the scene ceases to be ordinary. It carries ancient memory and tension that cannot be dissolved by treaties. The world calls it strategy. It calls it balance. It calls it necessity. When the boundary is reached, the labels lose relevance. There is an unseen axis sustaining the movement. There is a point where the march of nations meets something that cannot be pressured or intimidated. The siege may repeat. The storm may gather again. Even so, the outcome does not belong to armies. History continues. It does not determine itself.